Hello again, students. We're going to look today at the role of women as leaders within the progressive movement and the progressive movement's promotion of women's rights, eventually culminating with women's suffrage, which, please, for the love of all you hold dear, remember the word suffrage means the right to vote. It does not mean suffering. I don't want to see you on some prank show later on in life signing a petition to end women's suffrage because you don't know what the word suffrage means. Unless, of course, you actually want to end women's right to vote, in which case I don't want to see you on TV doing that either, you jerk. 19th century ideas about gender roles actually provided a way for women to become involved in reform movements as a way of becoming involved in politics. The concept was what was called the Cult of Domesticity, and it was based on the idea that there were two different spheres or worlds, the man's world and the woman's world. And the man's world was everything outside of the home, business, politics, and the like. And the woman's world was everything within the home, particularly raising children, education, and the family. And this cult of domesticity really elevated the role of the woman as wife and mother and as protector of the family. So women who wanted more political involvement could do so in a socially acceptable way by getting involved in reform movements, and had been doing so for 100 years prior to the progressive era. So it was no surprise that many women took on leading roles within the progressive movement. Middle-class women, for example, were looking for a role outside of the home and really fit well into this. And the cult of domesticity really applied to their lives for the most part. And there was also an increasing number of women within the middle class who were now college educated. The ideas of the cult of domesticity really only applied to middle and upper class women. Working class women found themselves in a position of having to work outside of the home in order to bring in enough money to support the family. So they oftentimes focused more on labor issues that the labor unions focused on. They also were oftentimes at the forefront of calls to end child labor and improving education for kids. And this fit in with the idea of women's role, even if that normally didn't apply to the working class women. Leaders among them, though, were oftentimes middle-class women like Florence Kelley, who formed organizations to protect both the workers and the consumer. And the consumer was becoming an increasingly important part of the economy. As we were producing more and more, we needed people to buy those things. And so Florence Kelley helped form the National Consumer League, which was concerned with fair working practices and safe working environments, as well as safe products. And they would, and they still exist today, will put stickers on products to let the consumer know that this was made in a safe working environment with fair pay, or that other sort of ideas there. Something you would see like fair trade is kind of an equivalent of that today. She also helped form the Women's Trade Union League, which lobbied for a minimum wage and an 8-hour workday, and actually created the first workers' strike fund, which was the union collected dues and held them in an account that if they went on strike, they could continue to give some money to the workers who were striking to continue to feed their families while not working. We'll see something of a success and failure in the Supreme Court case Muller v. Oregon. And what the court ruled was that an Oregon law limiting women's hours to a 10-hour workday was not unconstitutional. So while men still couldn't get laws that would limit the workday overall, women could. However, later on, employers are going to use this distinction that the Supreme Court drew between male workers and female workers to justify paying women workers less. In the progressive era, women will continue to play a prominent role in social reform movements. And one of the oldest female-led reform movements in this period was the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And the goal of the WCTU was to curb or ban the consumption of alcohol. And this fit very neatly in with the idea of the woman as the protector of the family, as many women would be victims to alcoholic husbands who perhaps at best would spend all of the family's money on drink, and at worst would become violent and abusive. And it is for this reason that many people involved in the temperance movement also supported women's suffrage, because if women had the right to vote, they would be able to pass laws restricting or banning the sale of alcohol. And indeed, this temperance movement will culminate with the 18th Amendment prohibiting the sale of alcohol anywhere in the United States. And we'll look a little bit more at the effects of that when we get to the 1920s later on. Women were involved in other social reform movements. For example, Margaret Sanger spoke out for women's productive health. And she was actually forbidden to do this by law. There were these anti-pornography laws that actually made it illegal for her to talk about birth control publicly. Margaret Sanger was arrested several times for doing this, and very famously would give lectures with a gag over her mouth, and she would write the lecture on the chalkboard because she was not allowed to speak about birth control. And then, of course, Ida B. Wells, I talked about before, wrote most well known for writing articles and giving speeches against lynching, but she also helped to promote the National Association of Colored Women, which focused on a lot of working class African American women's issues and supporting them by doing things like providing free daycare to them while they worked. The beginning of the women's rights movement in America is usually considered to be 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention. And at that convention, where they laid out the goals of this movement, one of the most controversial items was the right to vote, or suffrage, for women. It just barely made it in, but it had been part of their goals from the very beginning. And during the Progressive era, the women's suffrage movement is going to pick up some steam as women play such a prominent role in progressivism, and were they to be given a voice in the government, would be able to help push some more of these progressive legislations that they wanted to see. Susan B. Anthony was a prominent suffragist in the early part of the progressive era. And the two women, though, who will come to the forefront to sort of take us over the finish line are the two in this picture here. On the left is Carrie Chapman Catt, and on the right, Alice Paul. Carrie Chapman Catt was a charismatic speaker and became the leader of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NAWSA. And they pushed for women's political rights by using a sort of two-pronged approach. There would be some teams that would lobby directly to Congress for an amendment guaranteeing or protecting women's right to vote. But then there would also be other teams that focused on the state houses and trying to get states to pass laws allowing women to vote. Because who could and could not vote is still largely determined by the states. So there were individual states, particularly in the West, Wyoming was the first, to guarantee the right to vote for women, while not all other states did this. Alice Paul, on the right, on the other hand, was a much more radical voice. She formed the National Women's Party after something of a split with NAWSA, and she wanted to push for a much more confrontational approach. She used public protests and marches to grab the public's attention on the issue, and her group, the women they referred to as the Silent Sentinels, were the first people to ever picket the White House. They stood outside holding up signs in protest without speaking, pushing for women's rights, attempting to sort of publicly shame our government officials for denying half of the population their democratic rights. They were arrested. Hundreds of them were arrested. In one incident, they were force-fed because they went on hunger strikes when they were placed in jail. But the radical tactics of the National Women's Party and Alice Paul ended up making NASA look tame by comparison. As one historian put it, had it not been for Alice Paul, Carrie Chapman Catt would have been seen as the radical. Instead, she became sort of the moderate, sensible alternative that political leaders could turn to in an effort to bring about women's suffrage. Women's right to the ballot will finally be assured in all of the United States with the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. This was vehemently opposed by the liquor industry because of women's support for temperance and the fear that they would pass laws banning the sale of alcohol, and the textile industry because of women's opposition to child labor. But several factors will help persuade leaders. One, of course, is there were a lot of progressive politicians in Congress now who wanted to have the extra support of women who were, in the middle and upper classes at least, largely more likely to vote for progressive causes. But World War I plays an important role in this as well. America's involvement in World War I was framed by President Wilson as an ideal war, a war of ideals. He called it keeping the world safe for democracy. And NASA and the National Women's Party took two different tactics when it came to using World War I as a way of promoting a woman's suffrage amendment. NASA, through their support behind World War I and promoting it at home, thus winning a lot of the goodwill and support of President Wilson, who was prosecuting this war. The National Women's Party, on the other hand, embarrassed Wilson by standing outside of the White House when he was meeting with foreign dignitaries, particularly from the forming at this point Soviet Union, holding signs saying America is not a democracy because they were not giving the right to vote to half of their population, whereas the Soviet Union was much more inclusive of women and had just recently overthrown an autocratic monarchy in the Tsar. All of these things combined will allow the final culmination of this women's movement that had begun in 1848 with the right to vote. Examining the graphic organizer for lesson 3 really quickly here. This table is divided into 4 parts. The first part, I just want you to give me some of the motivations behind working class women and middle class women getting involved in the progressive movement. In the next section, I give you the names of several prominent women in the progressive movement and women's rights movement in the progressive era. And I want you to tell me how each one of them contributed to the progressive movements. And some of them, it might just be that they helped lead or form some of the groups in the next section of the chart. And for each of those groups, I want you to tell me what their goals were. What were they trying to accomplish? And then what sort of actions did they take, or what sort of accomplishments did they have towards those goals? The last part then is about the 19th Amendment, women's suffrage. Just answer those 3 questions. What did it do? I already told you. And what was the influence of the temperance movement and World War I in helping to bring about the final passage of the 19th Amendment? So as an example, I went ahead and filled in the National Consumers League for you. Their goal was safe workplace and safe products, and the actions they took was placing labels on products as well as backing government inspection laws. All right, je t'aime, au revoir.